Welcome to Tech Leaders Today with your host, Cassie Crossley. All comments, views, and opinions expressed on this show are strictly those of the host, guests, and callers. Now here's Cassie Crossley.
Welcome to Tech Leaders Today. I'm here with Darius Blasband. Darius has a master's degree and PhD from the Free University of Brussels. His focus is on legacy modernization, articulated around compilers for legacy languages. Darius is the founder and CEO of Raincode, main designer and implementer of its core technology, and acclaimed speaker in academic and industrial circles. He's also the author of The Rise and Fall of Software Recipes. Welcome, Darius.
Hi there.
I'm glad to have you here. This is an interesting topic about software development and the recipes concept. But before we begin, can you talk a little bit about Raincode and what you do there?
We started Raincode just under 20 years ago, my two partners and I. And the original idea was to provide services and products to manage source code in the sense of analyzing it, processing it, transforming it, measuring it, and so on and so forth. It's only later on that we expanded the scope to actually become a full-fledged compiler shop. And today, when we present ourselves, we usually say, well, Raincode is the biggest independent compiler shop in the world, in the sense of, obviously people like HP or Microsoft have more compiler engineers than we have, but you basically can't knock on these people's door and say, hi, I've got a problem, I need a bespoke compiler. Well, that's what we do. We do bespoke compiler and compiler-related services.
And your book, it has an interesting name. I read the chapter that discussed why you named it that way. Can you just give a summary of what your book is, and then we'll go into more detail?
The book really reflects. I've been doing this, I've been in this monkey business for 30 years now. And I say monkey business because that explains why the book is sometimes referred to as the banana book, right? It strikes me that every so many years, someone comes with what I refer to as a recipe and say, oh, this is how we should build software, without always reflecting what has happened before and what has consistently failed before. And the whole idea is for me to say, listen, I appreciate that the IT world is evolving. I appreciate that we don't use the same machine. We don't use the same software. Storage is free. Computing power is as good as free. I know all these things. But there's one factor that hasn't changed intrinsically, which is the intelligence of the human people who actually program those machines. That's us. We're not significantly smarter nor more stupid than our fathers were, really. For over 30 years, people have tried to organize software development so that they could increase quality and productivity. That's the nice way of putting it. How I usually describe it, they've been trying to develop adequate software with substandard people. The whole idea about methodologies and all these things I call recipes is trying to figure out a way of organizing the software development trade so that substandard people can be put in a frame that will allow them to develop more or less adequate software. And the whole point of my book, if there's something I would like people to remember, is this thing has been tried for 30 years. The basic material of that whole effort, namely the people who actually develop software, are not significantly better or worse than they have been for the last 30 years. And it has failed consistently for 30 years. At some point, I think it's time to realize it's not because we haven't found the right way, because there is no such thing as a right way.
When you're searching for technology team members, software developers for your team, how exactly are you looking for those resources? Is there certain skill sets, certain ideas? How do you approach that interview?
That's a long story. That's a very long story. First, and this is again not a very popular opinion nowadays, I say that software development is a trade. It is a professional trade. Would you be okay going to a dentist and say, well, I need a bridge, and the dentist says, well, I never did bridges, but I'm going to check Wikipedia, and I've got bridges for dummies lying on my desk, so I'll be okay. And by the way, I'm a gardener by trade. You probably wouldn't really want to go to such a dentist. How come our standards for software developers are so much lower than that? And we seem to be perfectly okay to have people who've studied, medieval history or whatever, and started software development on the side doing supposedly professional services. So the first thing I ask is a degree. Have you been studying this formally? Because Unlike many other people, it may have to do with the kind of things we do, namely compilers, language design. We still believe that there is added value in a strong theoretical background. That's the first step we ask. We only hire people that have been formally trained in, let's say, in computer science in a broad sense. Then I have a battery of 10 standard questions, and I always have to tell the potential hires that, don't be too nervous about this, because people routinely answer adequately to 3 out of those 10 questions. And that's fine. I can be perfectly okay with someone answering to 3 or even less than 3 out of those 10 questions, because those 10 questions go in many, many different directions in software development. It has to do with language theory, programming language implementations, algorithms, and more. It's a way for me to assess how the people's computing culture is biased. What is the kind of thing they've been doing? What's the kind of thing they really got out of their formal education?
And the technology folks, when you're recruiting them, are you looking for people who are fairly fresh out of university or with years of experience?
We're 50 people, out of which 2/3, 47, sorry. We're 47 people, out of which 2/3 approximately are technicians. So we hire people with various levels of expertise. I am given the specialization, which is ours, namely compilers. We do not expect most of our potential hires to be experienced in the field. It really is a niche thing. We expect the people we interview to be interested in this as a domain and ready to learn more about it, really. For me, it has been a strange experience. I even ended up hiring one of the guys who was in my PhD committee. And it's such a strange feeling that he comes to me and asks me what he needs to do, because I still have that respect thing that, he essentially took my PhD thesis and thought it was not entirely worthless. So,
Moving to the concept of technology, methodologies, and recipes, before we go into some of the areas that you may not agree with, how do you work within your organization? What have you found to be the best recipe or recipes?
That's the whole idea. There is none. There is no such thing as a good recipe. There is no such thing as a way of developing software independently from where, how, what for the software will be developed. That's the whole idea. I do not believe in recipes. Testing is obviously absolutely essential. Test-driven development put forward as a dogma is pointless because it drives people to just write tests. It doesn't drive them to write efficient tests that actually demonstrate something of value. The same goes with formal notations. Some things can be adequately represented in some form of formal notation. Not that I'm crazy about them, but I can appreciate that for many people. Say UML diagrams can help them really understand what it is that they're working on. It doesn't help me at all, but okay, I'm ready to appreciate that people can have different feelings about this. But what I'm adamant about is that claiming that as a matter of principle, UML diagrams should be used no matter what you're working on, no matter who the customer is, no matter how well specified the environment is pointless. The whole idea about me refusing recipes is that I don't have a single thing that I will apply blindly. The thing I try to avoid is the blind part.
The book has a section on Agile, which is a big trend right now. It is working very well with mobile apps and other areas. So I've changed the recipe or just sort of the method that I've followed depending on what goals I'm going to achieve. Do you find that you do the same when working with compilers? I have not worked on a team building compilers.
Yes and no. Yes and no. In the sense that, yes, obviously we need more flexibility. We need more agility. We need to not to have too strict a framework to put on our shoulders. But I resent quite a few things about the Agile movement. And I apologize because I appreciate that, people take this more personally than it's intended on my end. But where should we start? First, accountability. An Agile project, by definition, by structure, never fails. It never fails because there is no commitment. There is this idea, we work hard, we're going to do weekly delivery. Whenever it's over, Sometimes when you talk to agile people, I feel like, when I was 10 years old and I asked my father who was driving, when will we be there? And he said, well, be there when we'll be there. No commitment. So by definition, by construction, an agile project never fails. And when you look at so-called failed agile projects, they are always described as having failed for tons of reasons, but it's never because they were agile. As a matter of fact, the most commonly heard excuse for an agile project to have failed is the stakeholders did not understand agile, which can be translated into they were a little bit fed up just throwing money at a problem with no solution in sight. I resent in the agile world the infantilizing jargon, the Kanban, the Scrum meetings, the definition of done, all those funky words they find to describe stuff. By the way, having a jargon is typical of dogmas. If you look at my LinkedIn profile, I published a paper, I think it was almost a year ago now. So it was kind of ironic. So, please don't take this literally, but I made an ironic post explaining how agile was a full-featured religion because it has dogmas, because it has terminology, because it has a founding event, it has history, it has all the things that a typical religion has. The truth is, I thought the post was rather funny, and many people thought it was funny, and I got flamed big time. But among all the reactions I got, I had this guy who said, "Listen, I feel so sad for you. You haven't been enlightened. You didn't get the beauty of agile. Please let me convert you." And I'm pretty sure the guy didn't mean it ironically. Say, okay, what's the part in agile being a religion that I didn't make clear? The guy was literally trying to convert me. I gave lectures about my book across most of the civilized world. And sometimes I get flamed by people who say, oh, but agile is the only thing. You're stupid. Look at all these big organizations and they do agile. I say, okay, all these big organizations, they do agile. Fair enough. All these organizations use phones. Would you consider phones as being a critical thing? You say, no, it's a platitude. That's what everybody does. Well, that's all about agile. Agile doesn't introduce anything of significant substance. Agile is used by many developers as a way of regaining power in a software development project. It's a way for developers to avoid accountability. It's a way for developers not to have to obey to any external authority because they know better, because they do agile. So I resent many things in the agile world. This being said, most of what agile advocates as such is trivial and is not revolutionary in the sense of saying, okay, small increments. In many cases, it is useful. In many cases, it's the right thing to do, have small increments. Claiming that as a matter of principle, you need to be compilable all the time, for some projects is definitely counterproductive. Claiming you have to test without further ado can be counterproductive because people end up testing for the sake of testing, not for the sake of testing adequately. And the list goes on and on and on.
Well, let me take it back to your company then for a second. Let's say a company has hired you to build some level of compiler. If you don't follow a specific recipe, how do you approach that project? Are you setting success criteria, what the deliverables are? Do you have an iterative set of releases to that client? How do you approach it?
First, all compilers are different, really. The language are different, the runtime environment is different, the customer is different. But very typically, to develop a compiler, testing is essential and acceptance criteria are essential. In other words, one of the first things we do is say, okay, you want a compiler, how are you going to validate it? Do you have something like a test plan? And more often than not, the test plans are used as milestones. We say, okay, this is your test plan. Whether they provide it, it's a third party, it's a standard. Whether we sometimes even have to provide it because they don't even have a test plan to start with. But we say, okay, one milestone is going to be 25% coverage, 50% coverage, 75%, and so on. So that's one way of structuring the work. Another way of structuring the work is to see how many elements can we reuse, which makes a very, very big difference because depending on the language, we can reuse front ends, we can reuse back ends. The amount of code you can reuse has a significant impact on how the project will be structured. Other than these things that are very specific to compilers, we just divide the work into work items, which we make an estimate of the amount of work, we staff them, we take some contingency, but I cannot afford taking lump sums from my customers and telling my developers, you develop this in an agile way, let's just hope you make it within the budget, because that's just not workable.
Another chapter in your book that was interesting was, why do redevelopment projects fail? Can you talk about that? Because as technology executives who listen to this podcast, that is something that comes up all the time, redevelopment projects.
Oh, why do they fail? First, you have to realize that obviously I'm biased, and I have to apologize for that. But I'm biased because everything I do is about providing solutions so that my customers don't have to redevelop huge amount of software. So, whatever I say should be taken with a grain of salt. The book indeed does mention half a dozen reasons why redevelopment projects fail. The one which strikes me the most is optimism. When you start a redevelopment project, you compare a reality, which is the working system. And it is flawed. It is slow. The user interface is inadequate. You miss a number of functionality. It's written in old, awful, crappy, barely supported programming language, and the list goes on and on. But it's real. It's out there. And then you compare it with a non-existing system, with a fantasy, with something that you are about to redevelop. And you just can't have a clear mind when making that comparison, because you compare something which is ugly but real with something which is fantasized and therefore absolutely perfect. No one would ever say, oh, I'm starting this development project assuming that it will be late. So because you are comparing something which is potentially ugly with something which in your dreams is absolutely perfect, you are biased towards thinking that it's going to go fine, but it doesn't. It doesn't. And the math just don't add up. Something that has taken 20 years to develop, debug, and stabilize will not be redeveloped adequately in 2 years. It's just impossible. Because again, the most critical resource you depend on aren't the machines or the programming language or the methodology. They're just the people, and people are not significantly smarter nor dumber than they were 20 or 30 years ago.
Interesting. I've been through several large-scale redevelopment projects that have taken literally, as you say, 20 years of mainframe code and re-platformed them. And it took a lot of time, just as much time from technology and development as it took from the business, because they had to understand why they developed their processes. I think that all of us have seen, well, why do you do it that way? Well, it's because the program was written that way because it's the only way. There's potentially process re-engineering that should be also analyzed, which can extend a project to be years and years long. But they can succeed if you have the right goals in mind and the right framework and don't expect it to be a 100% match, because I think that also where there's quite a bit of failure, and in that the assumptions are that you would get a complete replacement, and that's never the case.
And it's never the case. We have a number of in-house systems, one of which is very dear to me, something which is very critical to the way we do business. And my partner sometimes say, well, shouldn't we throw it away? I say, listen, the truth is, I'd love to. I've got, despite what they think, I'm not emotional about this. I'm perfectly okay with throwing it away. I'm even perfectly okay with saying, listen, if we replace by something, trust me, I won't be dogmatic. I'll be okay with losing some functionality. And even so, I can't. Even so, they can't find a package that does match or whatever we need. But you're right. I mean, these redevelopment projects are never perfect matches. And there is a critical size beyond which it just fails out of probabilities. The probability of getting all the elements working in sync at the appropriate time is just close to zero.
Well, I'd really encourage people to read The Rise and Fall of Software Recipes. And you do mention in the book that it can be read in different portions. You can pick different topics that they're interested in. I will include the link in the show notes on how to obtain the book from Amazon. What are other ways that people can reach out to you if they have questions or want to find out more?
There is my website, DariusBlasband.com. Otherwise, my LinkedIn profile is easy to find as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being on the Tech Leaders Today podcast.
It's been my pleasure, really.
I want to thank you so much for listening today. If you love this podcast, please do share it with your friends and colleagues, and please leave a review on iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher because it makes a difference for circulation. For the show notes and other great info, enter your email into the mailing list at techleaderstoday.com. Thank you.